I do think the Judeo-Christian God, as it's understood, as something that summoned existence out of nothing, is a contradiction in terms. The idea of creating, for example, presupposes something to create whatever you create out of, and the idea of a consciousness presupposes the idea of something to be conscious of. But I'm, in general, don't like arguments that are meant to prove there's no God, because I think that kind of gets the cart before the horse. If someone claims there is such a creature, they should tell us why they think there is. And we should then think about, are those reasons any good, and does the kind of thing they're positing make sense, and are there reasons commensurate for believing it or not? And if not, we should reject it, rather than people saying, I believe in this kind of creature, show me there isn't one. Because if we go in that way, and it's not just about God, it's about any theory. I believe there's an international Zionist conspiracy, show me there isn't one. Or I'm a member of QAnon, show me I'm wrong. Or whatever crazy belief it is. It needn't be crazy, but whatever belief it is that you haven't been given evidence for. The content of the belief is so fungible until the reasons for thinking it have been given, that it's too much of a moving target to even try to refute it. So, again, the normal way the Judeo-Christian God is understood, I do think this idea refutes it. But ideas of God are moving targets.
Thank you. All right, before we go to the next question, the live stream started somewhere in the middle of that answer. So I'll just say once again that we're discussing the Metaphysical Versus The Man-Made with Dr. Gregory Salmieri at the London Ayn Rand Meetup. And Tom, do you have a follow-up for that question, or should we go to the next question?
Well, just to reiterate then, existence exists, and that has to happen first before consciousness. That is where I'd come to this conclusion. I think you
Yeah, put it another way, the idea of a consciousness that creates existence, not creates a certain thing within existence, but creates existence as such, is a contradiction in terms. That's the Rand view. I think that's right. It's something you have to kind of reflect on. What do we mean by consciousness, and how do we get that idea? But I think it's true.
Thank you.
George.
Yeah. So the question asked was about how metaphysics connect with ethics, and whether the reasoning that objectivism has, which says, okay, based on human nature, this is the proper ethics for us to make decisions about our lives, whether we are effectively falling into what Hume described as the is-ought gap, and whether it's impossible to bridge that gap.
I mean, this is not really the essay to discuss that in connection with. It's not about that. I'll say, I think ethics is about accepting that reality is what it is and deciding to live in it. And if one does those two things, I think the rest of ethics follows from that. It follows from accepting what our nature is, which we have to work to discover, but accepting that we are going to do that work, and that the nature of the things outside of us are what they are, and that given all of that, that we have the nature we do, and that the things in the universe have the natures they do, we choose to try to make a life for ourselves, or I choose to make a life for myself, to live as a human being in this world. And if I accept all those things, then I think, and I make that choice, then I think a range of principles follows from that about how to live. And I think that those range of principles are ethics. So that's, in general, what I think is the root of ethics. Now, the is-ought gap question, or the naturalistic fallacy, we have to go into what Hume means by that and why he thinks there's a problem doing that. And we could talk about that, but that would get us a field of what I thought was our topic for today. I'll say just again, the basic facts are the world has the nature it does, and we have the nature we do. And the salient facts about our nature are that we're living things. We have to act as living things in order to survive. not just any old course of action will enable us to remain in existence over time. There are certain kind of fundamental types of actions we need to take and need to avoid. And we need to do that all by choice, because one of the facts about us is that the faculty that's at the center of our life, the faculty by which we run, is reason, and reason operates by choice. And so then how, if you want to live, and you're that kind of creature, and you're in a world that has immutable laws that are what they are and that don't change and adjust to your wishes, how are you going to do it? Well, you're going to have to be rational and prize your rationality and cultivate it and develop it and not undermine it. And so that's the virtue of rationality, which is the central virtue. And then there are other virtues that have to do with are subordinate to that. You're going to have to be productive. You're going to have to recognize that the things that you need and want out of life and need in order to survive aren't going to come automatically. So you're going to have to do something to get them. Or if you don't, someone else is going to have to do something to get them for you, but you can't count on that happening. And those people will have no reason to give it to you or serve you. So you need to be productive. And you need to value having a purpose and making your life productive and having it have direction. And so that's the virtue of productiveness. And then we can go on through all the other virtues: independence, integrity, pride, honesty, integrity, did I say? Justice. And see how they follow from these basic facts. But all of that requires a lot of chewing and thinking through. And we want to do it in connection with having read one of the essays in which Rand talks about that. So the main ones for the different virtues are John Galt's Speech and Atlas Shrugged, and the essay The Objectivist Ethics, which is the first essay in the book The Virtue of Selfishness, and also in Philosophy Who Needs It, the book we're reading for the Metaphysical Versus The Man-Made. There's the important essay Causality versus Duty, which I think is a kind of one of a few that pairs nicely with the one we're reading today, Metaphysical versus the Man-Made.
Thank you.
Steve.
So, in the essay, she talks about building a skyscraper as being a man-made activity. So a skyscraper, in essence, is a man-made entity. But once it's built, at some point, it becomes sort of a metaphysical entity. So I wonder if you could explain that a little bit.
Well, I think the way I remember her putting it, maybe you're remembering a different line than I am, is that it becomes a fact.
Right.
So, and it's a man-made fact. So it's real, and we have no choice over it now that it's been built. We have no choice over the fact that it was built, and that it was built by a human being who chose to build it. So in that sense, it's not up to us any longer. It's a fact as much as anything that had to be by the nature of nature, as much as something that's metaphysically given. But part of what's the fact about it is that it was man-made, that it was caused in a certain way by someone's choices. That's different than the way a mountain was caused. That's the comparison she gives, right? By laws of nature operating without the intervention of anyone's choices. And we have to acknowledge that fact about it too. So even once the man-made has been made, so to speak, we have to continue regarding it as man-made, judging it as good or evil, as right or wrong that it was made, as right or wrong that it was made in the ways it was. And if we judge that it's bad, that doesn't mean it ceases to exist, right? We then have to decide what to do about it. Whereas if you decide, and part of what you'll do about it is thinking about what causes this kind of thing and how to promote or get rid of that kind of cause in the future. So the judging of the man-made is in effect justice. If we judge that this skyscraper was built well, we'll want to praise the architect and hire him again and give him an award and defend him against criticisms that are unjust and so forth. Whereas if we judge that it was built badly or shouldn't have been built, we'll want to do the opposite of all of those things.
Thank
you. So I think Luke had
question?
Yeah, it was similar though to George's, because it was about the ethical corollary of the essay, so perhaps it's not so relevant.
Okay.
I would like to ask a question, however, about leading on from the last question, about is there some sort of futility to bargaining with that which is metaphysically given? Because I see a lot of there is to some extent a lot of existential rage that happens with the facts of reality to say that, oh, the world is this way, the world is that way. Could we say something here about the malevolent universe premise and our power to change the metaphysically given, to selectively recreate it? Is there something to be said for that?
Well, I don't think you can literally bargain with what's metaphysically given. And I do think people make attempts to or try to. I mean, praying is basically that. A lot of what goes on in religious thinking is that. Now, sometimes what people are doing in praying is if they're not literally praying, but they're using it as a kind of way to articulate their desires or something. Maybe it's not this. But if you're literally, propitiating God to change what's unchangeable, or even what is changeable, but you're not going to change it, you're just hoping he'll do it for you, that is not accepting reality for what it is, and accepting that it works in the ways that it does, right? So that is just the kind of thing that she thinks is it comes from not making this distinction. And even apart from praying, there's a kind of griping over the unfairness, as you might see it, of life or nature. That's just, it's not the kind of thing that can be judged as fair or unfair. It's not the kind of thing to which that alternative applies. And all of that, wondering about whether it's fair that you were born with whatever attributes you were born with and not whatever ones you weren't. Any kind of concerns about the fairness or not of that is, again, a kind of attempting to judge reality by standards that are just not applicable. Because reality isn't what can be judged. It's the standard by which you judge the things that can be.
Dan, you had a question before. Do you want to repeat it? Dan, that's it. Your comment in the previous discussion. It's Dan, right?
Yeah.
All right. All right.
So I did have a question about, I'm trying to find the passage, but it talks about the denial that consciousness has an identity, and talking about how someone may look at the world, look at their own consciousness and think that one day they might feel invincible, they might feel like they can achieve anything if they think it, and then other times they think that their mind's impotent. And I think the passage says something like they don't recognize the fact that consciousness has an identity. So I recognize that as something that I did fall into before I read about this stuff.
Well, I think it's something that's easy to fall into in one way or the other. There are more technical versions of this problem where a theory of knowledge or a theory of something or other can be based on the idea that consciousness isn't anything in particular, doesn't have any particular identity. And you find all kinds of variants of that in kind of technical issues of philosophy. But there's also ways, and what you're referring to, I think, is more in this vein, in which it comes up in our own life, treating our own minds as things that are kind of outside the realm of cause and effect, as though our behaving, our making certain choices won't affect us and won't affect the kind of people who we become, as though we don't have characters that are built up over time by the additive decisions we make and by the kinds of circumstances we place ourselves in. And I think it's easy to find small ways in which I'm sure everyone has, at one time or another, acted as though his mind was sort of outside of the realm of cause and effect, or just hasn't noticed some of the ways in which cause and effect apply to your mind. And I don't mean in ways that deny that you have choice. I mean in ways that take into account that you have choice, but you have faculties that have a certain nature, that have certain needs. Those needs can be fed or frustrated, that you can't, that in order to know things, you have to put in certain work, and if you don't put in that work, you haven't known the things. That in order to, you can't therefore demand of yourself that you know things that it's impossible for you to know, or find out more quickly than you can. You have to set realistic standards for your own learning, for your own abilities, for your own self-improvement, and judge your progress accordingly, rather than imagining that the first time you try your hand to something, you'll be an expert at it, and then feeling disappointed if you're not. Right? And likewise with respect to other people as well.
Thanks.
One way she puts it in the essay that I think is significant, and you see a lot more of this in Causality versus Duty, is there's the healthy way of thinking, both about yourself and about reality, has a causality focus. If there's something you want to accomplish, you think sort of, what's required to accomplish this? How can this be accomplished? And then you decide whether or not to set about trying to accomplish it once you understand what's involved. But if you're on the wrong kind of premise, you're not thinking particularly of conscious phenomena as having causes and effects, you don't think about whether, what the actual natures of the things involved are, such that this thing has to be accomplished by these steps, and then you think about whether you want to do that or not. You think rather, am I up to it? So you leave it kind of amorphous, what has to be done to accomplish it, as though it either just was accomplished or not, but not by a process. And then you ruminate on yourself about whether you're good enough to accomplish it. And then typically people get mired in self-doubt by doing this, rather than thinking about, what are the steps.
So yeah, there's a line in Opa which struck me, and is basically to do with this, which is, I think it's, if you want to have the effect, you should enact the cause, something like that. And it's something that struck me when I read it. I was, okay, there's so many instances when I want something, but I have never bothered to think of how to actually cause this to happen. I just sort of, I'm in effect wishing for it to happen.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's common, and part of what I think having a real part. I mean, none of us is like that way in all areas of our life, or few people are. Those people who are like that way, who are like that in all areas of their lives, are leading pretty bleak lives, right? But we want to understand in the areas of our life where we are effective, where we are able to achieve what we want. The whole way that we go about wanting in those areas of life is different than in areas where you just kind of passively wish for things, don't think about how to bring them about, don't have the thinking about how to bring them about as part of your thinking about whether you want them or not, and don't act. If you're in an area of life where you really think about, you make your decisions about what to pursue and what you want in a way that's cognizant of all the causes needed to achieve it, and you think of it as a whole, an effect achieved by a certain cause that you choose, or else you decide you don't want it and you don't choose it. That is a very different way of wanting. And that way of wanting, where you're choosing the thing as an effect of a cause that you're choosing to implement, and otherwise you don't hold it as a goal at all, because it's not really a goal at all if you're not willing to act for it. You have no idea how to act for it. That positive way of valuing is what real value pursuit is. And the other type of value pursuit is more like a fantasy. It's kind of wishful thinking, not actually valuing. And if you can get in touch with that difference in yourself, in your own life, seeing in what areas you're one way versus another, and how it feels different in those areas, and how much more clarity there is on the goals in those areas than there is in the other areas. It can put you in touch with what it is to really value in a reality-oriented way, what it is to be a rational valuer. And then you can try to apply that more broadly in your life.
All right, everybody's gone really shy ever since we started the live stream. You know, we had a lively discussion before, but one of the things that came up was if and how inductive and deductive reasoning correlate with the primacy of existence and the primacy of consciousness.
Well, both forms of, I don't think one form of reasoning goes with one and the other with the other. They're both essential to proper reasoning. So you can't reason only inductively and never deduce. You'd end up with a whole lot of general statements that you wouldn't be able to do anything with. And that's not reasoning, that would be a kind of playing. And likewise, if you just deduce, but you never look to reality, to particulars, to get the principles to induce the general things from, that you never look at the particulars to check whether your general principles are right, and you don't try to build them up from there, you're just building castles in the air, you're not really thinking. So real, genuine, reality-oriented thinking involves induction and deduction, not one or the other. And so we can't pair them off with two, that is, induction and deduction, one each with two different approaches to reality, one of which is reality-oriented and the other isn't. I think what, if you're going to say that the primacy of consciousness is associated with an approach to induction and deduction, I think what it would be associated with is not one or the other of the two, but the kind of severing of them from one another. Whereas a primacy of existence approach would be related to a seeing of them as inseparable parts of the whole, which is the process of thinking about the world.
Did the person who brought that up have a follow-up? No. All right.
Is our consciousness man-made or metaphysical? Metaphysically given?
That's a good question. Is our consciousness man-made or metaphysically given? The fact that we are conscious at all, that we have a faculty of consciousness, is metaphysically given. The fact for each person, certain general features of human consciousness, that it works in a certain way, that it has certain physical requirements for it to function, that it has certain psychological needs and so forth, that's metaphysically given. And then different details of all of those facts for each individual person are metaphysically given. You have certain abilities that somebody else might not. Maybe you're born with a little bit of a different brain. Maybe somebody is born with a certain brain impairment, or he's blind, let's say. And that's metaphysically given, that you're conscious visually, whereas he has the other senses, but not that. So all of those kinds of things are metaphysically given. But part of what's metaphysically given about our consciousness is that we have choice. And we have choice in particular over how to use our minds. In particular, we have choice over whether or not to engage, to turn on our reasoning, or whether to turn it off and push reality away from us. And that is man-made. And so are a ton of effects on our own consciousness that happen over time because of the choices we make. So it's a fact about your consciousness now, for example, that you know certain things and not others. And that is largely man-made. You know certain things because you chose to look into them, to think about them, and so forth. You don't know others because you didn't choose to look into those things. Now, there are other factors, too, about what evidence was available to you. But anything that you know that you took time to learn and made an effort to learn, it's because of your choice that you know that. And anything that you could have learned but didn't, because you didn't decide to pursue that knowledge, it's also up to your choice that you don't know that. Not only our knowledge, but also a lot of facts about our character. If you're a courageous person or a coward, that's not something you were born with. It has to do with the choices you made. If you're an honest person or a dishonest person, or anywhere in between on any of these scales, this has to do with the choices you've made. So our character is man-made, and our knowledge is man-made, above the perceptual level knowledge. But our nature as knowers and our basic faculties are metaphysically given. So in that sense too, it's the same as with your body. It's metaphysically given that you have muscles and so forth. But if you're really pumped, because you spend a lot of time at the gym, that's man-made, and likewise the opposite.
Thank you. I'm glad you noticed.
I missed that joke. It got lost in the internet.
So, I'm glad you noticed.
His muscle.
His muscles.
So would you say that there is something about a selective recreation and a process of altering that turns something from metaphysically given to man-made? So say George was given muscles, but he decides to work out with them a lot. Are his muscles then part metaphysically given, part man-made, or what's the process of alteration? Could you describe some of that process?
So proud of
I
this.
wouldn't say that they are part and part, where they turn from one to the other. George is shrinking out of view. It's
No, I'm stretching.
I would say that there are muscles at all is metaphysically given, but that they're in a certain condition
Is man-made.
is man-made. The condition of being, bulky and strong or whatever,
Yeah.
toned.
Because I remember we had a question earlier about, in our conversation prior to the stream, about the point at which a skyscraper becomes man-made from the metaphysically given. And it's just interesting to scale up that example that, can it be done by essential characteristics? So we'll have a bit of
I
a epistemology.
wouldn't say the skyscraper becomes man-made from being metaphysically given. The stuff that the skyscraper is made of is, the proximate stuff that the skyscraper is made of is man-made. Right? It's made of steel and concrete and so forth, none of which exist in nature. So the steel and the concrete are man-made. Okay, but the steel is made ultimately from rocks that get melted down and etc. And the concrete also. So if you go back to before anyone did any work, you get rocks and the fact that there's a certain mineral nature in the rocks and whatever the elements are, right? Those things are metaphysically given. Those things remain metaphysically given. The atoms that are in the steel or whatever remain metaphysically given when the steel is a skyscraper. What's not metaphysically given is steel or the skyscraper. And steel is a certain arrangement of those atoms and molecules, right, into a certain alloy. And that alloy, that arrangement, is made by human beings. So the steel is made by human beings from something that's metaphysically given. And then the skyscraper is made by human beings from something that's man-made, the steel, which was itself made by human beings from something that was metaphysically given. So what's metaphysically given is the sort of basic unchangeable natures of things. And the way those things were arranged by natural laws and processes prior to any human beings intervening in them.
Amen.
So I don't know if this is not a difficult question, I don't think, but the nature of nature is outside the power of any volition. Is that the right quote? So it's one of those quotes that sort of strike me. I think, okay, sort of makes sense, but can you elaborate on what she means by that?
Yeah, so nature is those set of things that came about not by human agency. And it's nature. I mean, it's a kind of play on word, nature, right? The nature of nature. So nature refers to that set of things that came about by nature, came about on its own apart from human agency. came about due to causal principles internal to it that don't involve choice. And something's nature is those facts about it, including especially that are related to how it will act, that are inherent in its existence, inherent in its identity, apart from anyone's choice. And so the facts about the things that we haven't caused, such that they are what they are and act as they do, is not up to us and not open to our choice. And that's something that, I mean, the whole idea of a nature is something that you get by contrast to choice. So in effect, this isn't telling you something new that you should need to learn once you have the idea nature. It's kind of reminding you of part of what goes into forming the idea of nature in the first place. You understand what's natural by distinction from what's artificial, by distinction from what's made by a human being. And if you look at even the origin of discussions of nature in Greek philosophy, it's always what's natural versus what's made by art or custom. That's where the whole idea comes from. Physis, nature, versus nomos, or versus techne. Here I am pronouncing Greek with Greeks watching me, so probably you guys say it all differently now. But what's inherent in things apart from consciousness and choice, nature, versus consciousness and choice. And once we have the idea of nature and the natures of things, part of having that idea is having the differentiation between that and the chosen.
Yeah.
So if a man and a woman make love and create a new life, is that kind of
Yeah.
nature or man-made?
Is that what?
Is that nature or is it man-made? The new life, the baby.
Well, that they make love is man-made. They didn't have to do it.
Yeah.
Right? That they didn't use protection, or if they did, that it, so whether or not they used protection is man-made, whether or not they aborted the fetus is man-made. But what's metaphysical is that if they do make love, there's semen and eggs, and the semen goes through certain passages, and it will combine with the egg. And if it does that, you get a fertilized embryo, and it develops in a certain way. So it's metaphysically given that human beings come about in a certain way. It's not metaphysically given whether the people were made in the first place, and whether the process will then proceed uninterrupted. So if you have a kid, that kid is man-made, in the sense that it's up to your choice whether he existed or not, and that's in part why you have a responsibility to it. But it's not up to your choice, for example, what color eyes he'll have, or whether he'll have certain hereditable diseases, or any of the things about him that we say are, that aren't up to our choice. We don't have an ability to control that.
We do choose our partners based on
What?
we do tend to choose our partners also based on the expectations of what our children will look like, and whether their diseases, they're going to be immune to certain diseases. I mean, that's what I've read about pheromones. No, that's not what I've done. I've read that it's even like you don't do it consciously. You don't choose.
Well, so to whatever extent we have or learn to control those things, then it will become more man-made, whether we have children with certain features.
Yeah.
But even then, it will be metaphysical that if you pass on this gene to your child, then your child will have this phenotypic trait that's coded for by the gene. Now, I don't think it's true that we actually, and there's all this evolutionary biology talk, and it even existed before that, to the effect that we choose our partners based on what kind of offspring we'll have. I don't think we do that in the literal sense. I mean, you're with someone and you've had a kid. It's the way you were looking at her. Those are birthing hips, and I want my kid to have those kind of eyes and so forth. That's not how people normally function. Now, maybe occasionally you have thoughts of that type. Boy, I really like a kid who has this trait of my wife or girlfriend. Now, maybe it's the case, it's alleged to be the case that behind the things we find attractive are the fact that we at some level know or have evolved to be attracted to the things that will produce good offspring. But, I mean, people are attracted to, some women are attracted to men who abuse them. And habitually have a pattern of going with this type of man time and time again. And some men are attracted to women who, play out some horrible problem they had with a past girlfriend or with their mother. I mean, the things that human beings are attracted to are so variable that I think it's kind of bizarre to say that they're all what's going to make for good kids, right? We know that there's a huge variance in some people are only attracted to people with a certain color eyes or a certain tallness, and other people to totally different things of that sort. Some prefer blondes and some brunettes, and some people prefer having sex with people of their own sex rather than the opposite sex. There's so much variability. I don't think we can say that this is due to what will lead to offspring or good offspring, especially since the types of sex some people favor we know don't produce offspring at all. So I don't think that's what's behind human sexual choices. It might be that there is some overlap for some traits that a lot of people find attractive, and that wouldn't be shocking. But I don't think it's the kind of overall driving factor in sex selection for human beings.
So on that point, I mean, how much of it is sort of, it's not innate, but sort of, how much of it is volitional, if any part of the people we're attracted to or the people,
Well, that's one of these issues that I mentioned earlier, where it's not obvious what's volitional and what isn't, right? So, and part of what's knowing that there's a distinction between some things that are up to us and some things that aren't can help us spot it in cases where it's obvious, and in cases where the distinction isn't obvious can prompt us to do the research we need to or the thinking we need to discover it. So it's unclear sexual preferences. It's just not obvious. It's obvious on the face of it that you don't choose your sexual preferences. And I mean this, take the full wide range of sexual preferences, whether you're gay or straight, whether you like taller or shorter or thinner or fatter or this or that, or people of whatever sex you like, or how important sense of humor is to you in a partner, all the different things that can be part of what you find attractive or not, right? It's pretty clear that none of them do we simply choose. I'm going to be attracted to slender, gregarious redheads, and I made that decision someday, and then henceforth I was. That people don't do that kind of thing. Just like people don't choose to be gay, right? The questions are what kinds of choices are involved in the formation of our preferences, and to what extent are our preferences mutable by choice? And I think that's a question that we don't know that much about the answer to yet. I think we know our experiences have some role in the preferences we form. I think we know our genes probably have some role, but just what roles they are, I think it's hard to determine. I think we know to some extent these things are changeable. In particular, the moral relevant character ones are changeable. So if you find yourself attracted to a kind of person that's bad for you, and I mean bad for you for reasons of how they behave, they beat you or they lie to you or so forth, right? And this is coming, there's something psychological that this is coming from. Maybe you don't feel like you're good enough for another kind of person, and there are methods that people go through to try to change these things. If you go to a therapist, they can think, why are you playing this pattern out? Why are you always attracted to these kinds of people? And you can discover maybe choices or things you've done or experienced or conclusions you formed in the past that led to this being the case with your preferences now. And you can come up with things you can do to try to change this about yourself. And people do change these things about yourself. Likewise, if you find that you have some super limiting set of sexual, like, only women who are exactly 5'4" with exactly this complexion, you've got some sort of super specific type, and you can hardly find anyone like that, and you only like that also is probably something that's mutable and changeable, and probably coming from something unhealthy. On the other hand, no one seems to know, put aside whether it would be a good thing to do or not, no one seems to know of a way to change sexual orientation from straight to gay or gay to straight, right? So whether or not that was caused by choices or by genes or by environment or whatever combination of those that is caused by in one's past, no one knows a way to change it in the present. And there are other ones that are morally relevant in a way I don't think that being gay is. I mean, some people are pedophiles and they find themselves only attracted to young children. And it's morally monstrous to sleep with them, right? To have sex with them. It's abusive. And these people really want to change this. Some of them, the ones who are decent people, right, want to change this. And we don't know how this comes about. And we don't really know that much about how to change it. But we know that it's important when judging these people and when deciding what to do about them, and if someone were to find himself with these desires, in figuring out how to judge himself and what to do going forward, to think about the issue of what's in my control versus what isn't in my control. What can I do about the things that are in my control? What steps can I take to, if I can't change this desire, prevent myself from acting on it and prevent myself from being miserable while I'm not acting on it? Or if I can change the desire to change it, or if I don't know whether I can change it or not, what can I do to figure out what's changeable? And so that's the case with horrible desires like the desires of a pedophilic person. And it's the case with all kinds of motivations. If you have phobia of something, right? It's not in your choice now not to be afraid of the thing. But we can think about, well, how do these kind of phobias get caused? Do we know of ways to either change them or mitigate their effects? And sorting out kind of carefully, and it can require expert knowledge. Maybe you need to see a therapist, with this, or read a lot about it, to parse out in subtle ways what things are up to you and what way things are not. And then figure out how to deal with them.
Yeah, so I have a follow-up question to what you've just been talking on. You talk a lot about choice, and it seems to be there's limits to consciousness where there's desires that you can't prevent. Where does free will, are there limits to free will in consciousness?
There are limits to free will in the sense that there are certain things that we have control over and certain things that we don't. So free will, I think, is the ability to engage or disengage your mind. The ability to put yourself on a truth-seeking premise, on a clarity-seeking premise. The ability to welcome facts and try to understand them as best you can, or to push that away. And I think that we have absolute control over. Now, there are times when you're too tired to think through something, but, or there are all kinds of where you're drunk or whatever. There are lots of situations in which you might not be able to solve a problem or think it through, or you just might not be smart enough to solve a certain problem, or might not have enough information to solve a certain problem. But so long as you're awake and basically functional, you're able to either do your best to get at the truth, or to try to avoid doing that. And that's what our free will, I think, is in essence over.
All right, I have a follow-up for that. So I think you were asked after your talk at Ocon on the Fountainhead about the scene where Keating shows Rourke some of his paintings towards the end, and Rourke says it's too late. So, can you talk about that in the context of what we can change and what we can't?
Yeah, and so this is a heartbreaking scene, right? Keating has returned to a childhood ambition to paint. He's done some paintings. He shows them to Rourke. Rourke says it's not just they're no good, Peter, but it's too late. So Peter cannot now become a painter, and maybe more generally cannot now become a decent human being. So I think we should keep in mind in interpreting what's meant by that scene, that Keating is not just a guy who didn't start learning to paint until he was older, in his 30s or 40s. And he's not just a guy who didn't explore one of his values or put off or even suppressed something that was important to him until his 40s, right? He's a guy who sort of murdered somebody. I mean, kind of badgered somebody to death, to producing a stroke, expecting that it would happen. He's a person who's betrayed his best friend and his fiancée. This is a person who's for years and years and years and years made consistently really awful choices. So the point, whatever bad consequence there is to Peter that he can't bounce back from in Rourke's view, it's not just he didn't learn to paint until too late, or even he didn't pursue something he really loved until too late in life. He spent a life being a real creep and really subverting what's best in him in dramatic ways that most people don't do. And now there's the question of, can he bounce back from that? What can he develop into now by making better choices going forward? And I don't know whether Rourke's view of Keating is too bleak or not. One, they're both fictional characters, so it's sort of, only as the author made them. But if you imagine a real-life equivalent of a Keating, what would be the most realistic growth trajectory for him going forward? Or is any growth trajectory too late? Is it too late for him? I don't know. And I think it's really a point for psychology more than philosophy. But I think what we can say as a matter of philosophy is that our choices have effects on us, and the effects linger. And if you've consistently chosen awful things for decades and been a really wicked person, you can't just turn over a new leaf tomorrow and everything will be hunky-dory. And it'll be as though you didn't live as a rotter for 30 years, 40 years. It would take a long time of gradually building yourself back up, and then you'd never reach the heights that you would have been able to reach had you been making better choices from the beginning. You'll maybe be able to, not have it be such that at the end of your days you've lived a life not worth living. But you won't be able to regain the time that you've spent doing the bad thing, and that you spent subverting your life and so forth. So this point is an example of, or an instance of, the point that consciousness has identity, and the choices you make have effects on your own consciousness. And it's just like physiological effects. So if you've spent 40 years smoking, you can quit smoking now. And it'll have effects on your lung capacity and so forth, and your risk of cancer and dying of cancer will go down if you now quit smoking and adopt other healthy lifestyle choices and so forth. But it's never going to be as though you were never a smoker. At least that's my understanding with smoking. If that's not the case with smoking, then there's some other thing you can do that's like that, right? Your health trajectory will never be as good as someone who did all the good things you did later in life and didn't do the harmful things you did earlier in life. And likewise for Keating's character trajectory. And then the questions of what he could hope to achieve, if anything, by making the right choices now versus what he can't is a good question. And in some ways, I think Rourke is too optimistic towards Keating late in the novel. I mean, he thinks that Keating will be able to uphold Keating's side of the deal with Cortlandt Holmes, right? And I think Rourke's wrong to think that, and Rourke later realizes he was wrong to think it. So in one respect, Rourke thought that Keating had grown into somebody who was able to accomplish something that he wasn't able to accomplish. In another respect, Rourke thinks Keating isn't able to grow into somebody who could be a decent painter, with something to say in his painting. Maybe he's wrong on that side too, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we talk a lot about kind of making choices, right? And obviously, Keating made many bad choices, although he was a very intelligent person, at least the way I understood it in the book. What role does intelligence play, from your point of view, in making these choices? And if intelligence is not the main variable to make good choices, what other kind of variables are more important?
Well, intelligence is an interesting thing because it's not clear to me exactly what it is. So there are different ways of measuring it, and if you think of it kind of crudely, as intelligence is the ability to think well or solve problems or something like that, right? Well, your ability to do that is definitely affected by the choices you make. Different kinds of education make people better or worse at problem solving. If you're tired all the time, you're going to be less good at problem solving than if you're less tired. If you're honestly trying to solve the problem, you'll be better at solving it than if you're not honestly trying to solve the problem, but are just trying to show somebody up or avoid dealing with the fact that you didn't solve the problem well last time. There are all kinds of things that you can make choices over that will impact your ability to solve problems, even in the moment. And then that years of making those kinds of choices will either heighten or lessen your ability to solve problems over time. So what we might mean by intelligence is this ability in which we know that our choices, both in the present moment and over time, are a factor. Or what we might mean by intelligence is some kind of innate or basic ability, the power of your internal microchip, so to speak, that is a constant, and these other things that we're talking about are like changes in your operating system or whatever that can make the chip operate more or less efficiently. So I don't know what we mean by intelligence when we talk about intelligence, except to say that in any of our actual abilities to do thinking, both whatever our innate endowments are and whatever choices we make and whatever knowledge and methods we've been exposed to, so all three of those things are a factor in our actual working ability to think well. Now, the other question you asked was, what is it besides intelligence that's involved in making the right choices? And I think if the fundamental choice is really this embracing reality, embracing wanting to know, versus rejecting it, deciding to pursue the truth versus push it away, that's not something you need to be smart versus dumb to do. That's something you can do at any level of intelligence, or at least at any level that a normal human being would be at. And then what is it that causes that choice? Well, on the theory, which I think is right, that is our fundamental or basic choice, there's nothing that causes it other than you. It's a choice that you are faced with, and you have to choose one versus the other. And there's no factor that makes you or faculty that pushes you to go one way rather than the other. That's just what it means to say that it's a basic or a fundamental choice. It's a choice it's up to you to make, that you can go either way on, and that nothing makes you go one way or the other than you're choosing to go one way or the other.
Yeah. So just as a follow-up question, so this sounds like a very obviously rational approach and kind of neutral. that sometimes people who have a very, very positive attitude to life make much better choices. So in what sense has let's say the attitude to life, let's say a positive attitude or negative attitude, an impact on that?
Could you give me an example of the positive and negative attitude leading to better or worse choices?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. For example, depressed people, I mean, probably making many, many bad choices, and people who are, wake up in the morning with a smile and say, "Hello, sunshine," probably make better choices.
I think what I was just saying about fundamental choices is meant to apply to a certain category of choice that's, well, fundamental. And the derivative choices that we make, that you would, in ordinary circumstances, describe as a good or bad choice. It was a good choice to go out on a second date with this person. It was a good choice to turn down that job offer and accept this one. It was a good choice to go to this university and not that one, or to drop out of university and start a company. Those kinds of choices, which there I think a lot of factors factor into those choices. One of the factors is this primary choice, whether you're choosing to be reality focused or not. And other factors are, well, a whole lot of psychological complexity, including what mood you're in and whatever else there is, some of which things are results of previous choices of yours and some of which aren't. So if we're talking about these downstream choices, so to speak, then I think there are a lot of factors that go into them. But the kind of basic lever you have by which you can exercise your control, whatever control is up to you, over all the other factors that are a factor in these downstream choices, is the choice you make about how reality oriented to be. And so, for example, if you are someone who suffers from depression, if the depression is bad enough, and while you're in severe enough depressive episode, you might not be able to choose to be reality focused at all. Maybe you're just, you can't even get out of bed. You can't function at all in these periods. People with very bad depression, that might be the case. But if you're not like that all the time, and you have times when you are more competent, in those times, do you choose to think about, well, what is my situation in life? It's a fact that I have these depressive episodes, and there have been other people who've had them, and there are ways that are supposed to be good for dealing with them. There are medications. Should I look into them? There are psychiatrists. How do I find the best one? Are you doing that kind of thinking? Are you thinking about how can I figure out what I can control here and try to do my best to make my life as good as it can be? Or are you just pushing that all out of mind as though you have no control? And that would be the kind of decision that I think is up to us, and that then is going to have a lot of downstream effects on what's going to happen to the person the next time they have a depressive episode, or whether they have one again. Whether they'll have a support system around them to help them deal with it. And likewise with smaller things. If you notice that you're always dour and grumpy, and that this is impacting your view of things, and whenever somebody offers you an opportunity, you always think, well, he's trying to put one over on me or whatever, and you're just, someone who's just grump, and this is leading you to make bad decisions. You can think about, George is looking back to Razi, is this yeah. So if you find that you're like this, right, and you notice evidence of it, first, are you sensitive to evidence? Or when evidence is coming back that something in your life isn't working for you, are you always push it out of mind and you don't try to think about it? Or you think, boy, this has happened a few times now. A couple of people have told me that it's because I'm such a bitter guy that these problems keep happening to me. I'm not sure if that's right, but I should at least look into it. And then you do look into it, and you start to find evidence that there is something and that there are ways to address it. And, you take a class or read a book or think about how can I improve my attitude. And over time, you can improve your attitude. Versus you get defensive about it and don't admit that that's the case. Or don't admit that it might be the case when you don't know yet. You just close your mind off to considering that possibility. It's that kind of thing that I think is the locus of where our control over our lives is.
Yeah, and one final follow-up question. What's your view on people who make all their decisions based on gut feeling, on instinct?
On gut or instinct?
Yeah.
First, I should say before I continue, since there's a joke about this, in my experience, Rothy's been a lovely guy. All my experiences with him are positive, since George is gesturing back at me. People who make all their decisions based on gut instinct.
It's not true.
Well, I mean, I think we have to.
Is it possible?
I think we have to. So, there are certain kinds of decisions that, by their nature, have to be made quickly. I mean, suppose you're playing tennis or something, and you think, boy, this guy didn't pause to think about how to respond to that serve. I mean, these are decisions that have to be made in a split second, right? So, and we all have tons of decisions like that you have to make only based on your gut in the moment. And the questions for thought are what you do in the moment when those decisions aren't happening to assess and improve what's going to occur to you in those moments. Now, I assume what we were talking about when you talk about people who make decisions based on their gut is something like you're in a meeting where you have to decide whether or not to go forward with this design for a new telephone or something. And there's a lot of data that's presented, and it seems like the data is pushing in one direction, and yet you just feel like, no, this is wrong. This new design is ugly, and I don't like it, and this other design is better, and my gut just tells me to go with that one. And you have time to read more into the data, but you do, but still you can't get rid of this feeling that the other thing is right and so forth. And so you go with your gut on that situation. Or you're not so interested in the data because you think my quick reactions on this stuff are reliable. Well, then I think the question is how reasonable are you being in thinking that your so-called gut reactions are reliable? Right? So if you're someone like Steve Jobs and you've been found over time to have really good taste in aesthetics, and focus groups on aesthetic issues are shown to lead to kind of very conservative product choices that fare fine but don't ever revolutionize things and so forth. And what you might call your gut or your kind of intuitive view of what's a beautiful product or what's a product that's worth pursuing, you might reasonably think is better than the focus group judgment. Now you have to be able to think rationally about whether that's true. Are my instincts, as you might call them, that on this issue, is my skill at discerning these things that I've honed over years of life, right? Because it doesn't come from nowhere. Better and more accurate than these other kinds of judgments, such that I should go by them, or not. Now, usually, if one is really good at making these kinds of judgments, one can articulate how one's judging to some extent, right? So if you show Steve Jobs 2 phone designs and he tells you one's ugly and the other is beautiful, it's not like he can't tell you anything about why he thinks it. He can probably tell you a lot about why he thinks it, but maybe not in sort of at some level of detail it bottoms out. So that fact that you can explain to some extent and that you have evidence about how good you are at making these kinds of judgments on the fly would be evidence that would support you in going with that kind of judgment. On the other hand, if you're someone who just is resentful at thoughts about thinking things through, you've always made judgments by your gut in the past. You think they've always worked out because you're unwilling to question and think about whether they really have always worked out. And you haven't died yet, so you think, well, it must be okay. But you haven't realized that you'd have twice as much money and a much better life if you'd proceeded otherwise. then in your financial dealings, I imagine, then you're being irrational in going by your gut and have been the whole time. And there's not a simple formula to discover, other than thinking about the essence of rationality is that you're truth-seeking, and the essence of irrationality is that you're truth-avoiding. And which are you being in going by your gut, so to speak, at least?
Can I bring up the T word, Trump? I think he acts by gut instinct most of the time, and he's achieved a lot. But is he rational?
Well, I don't think it's clear that he has achieved a lot. He's become president.
He is president, he's achieved that, and that was his goal. You may not value that, but he does.
Well, but goals are not unavaluable. So what your goals are themselves things that can be evaluated and can be rational or irrational. And so let's put it aside from Trump in particular and talk about the philosophical one, then we can come back to Trump. But if your goal is to take someone who's by all our accounts worse than Trump, right? If your goal is to become, a brutal dictator and murder, if your goal is Stalin's, right? That's not a rational goal, nor was Hitler's, nor was a lot of people. And whatever our view about present politics, we'll all have some people in present politics whose goals we think are bad, right? We'll agree on a lot of them and disagree about some of them. So you can have irrational goals that you're pursuing because you want to prove something to yourself, because you want to address some insecurity you feel, goals that you're pursuing as a means of evasion. And you can have rational goals. And it's unclear for any political leader whether their goals, we have to think about what their goals are and how they're holding them to hold whether they're rational or irrational goals in the first place. Then, with respect to Trump becoming president, it's unclear to what extent that was due to skill and good decision making and to what extent it was due to luck. And if we look at his career prior to his becoming president, which is the more interesting part of it, I think, for assessing him as a person, prior to him running for president, right? I think there's, it's a complicated mix of things that he did well and things that were, he did badly and failed, and things that were results of luck. And it's hard to assess how much of that was, what was due to what. So just viewed in terms of how much money he has, it looks like he did less well than the market by most indices. And insofar as he didn't go totally out of business in the 90s when his real estate investments all tanked, the reason he didn't go totally out of business in the 90s was that, my understanding is anyway, that the banks were willing to not have him go into bankruptcy because they realized that the value of his personal brand would be ruined by his going into bankruptcy. And the value of that brand was essential to him, them being able to get any return on their investment. Now that, though, the fact that he came up with this business strategy of building everything around a personal brand, right, and that he was good at building up a personal brand, was that an achievement? Probably it was, similar to the achievements of some of the Kardashians and so forth. There are people who are good at marketing themselves and might think well about marketing themselves. Was Trump being really rational in that area of his life? And maybe irrational with other investments, or maybe he was rational with all of them, but just got unlucky. He took gambles, and he knew they were gambles, and some worked and some didn't. And you have to think about, you know a fair amount about business, and know a fair amount about his business, to assess to what extent his fortune, his public status, and so forth, again, taking this all before he went into the presidency, was an achievement. To what extent it was all achievement, and to what extent it was, achievements in this area but not in that area. And those are hard questions. They shouldn't be obvious to any of us who haven't really studied them. What I think as a political figure, he's a sort of avatar for irrationality. But that's sort of a different matter from his business career, which is harder to assess. And what I mean by him being an avatar for irrationality in politics is he's someone who's constantly bandying about conspiracy theories, is contemptuous of the need for evidence, and has gained a following doing that. Now, it might be that he's not really like that in the privacy of his own mind and is cunningly lying to people and pretending to be this kind of person to gain a following. But even if so, I don't think that's rational, although that is a way to achieve a short-range, irrational goal of being a demagogue. And on the other hand, maybe he really thinks like this. And in either case, I don't think it's rational. So as a political figure, I think he's a really troubling development and a kind of example of irrationality in action. But his career as a business person is, harder to assess. I don't think there's nothing good he did ever as a
Tom, are you
businessman,
gonna
and
ask
I'm not sure how good.
about Trump?
A small follow-up, but not necessarily about Trump, about luck. So I tell my kids, luck doesn't exist. Preparation meets opportunity is what luck is.
Mm-hmm.
Because, if you're not prepared, you can't take advantage of an opportunity. Do you truly subscribe to the idea of luck?
In a certain sense of luck, yeah. So there are situations in which the best you can do, there's where certain outcomes are going to be within a range of possible ones, and a range of ones that can be rationally anticipated. There's going to be a kind of space where you can't tell. You know that one of these three things is going to happen, let's say, and you know what the odds are, but you don't know which one of those three it's going to be. And what you can rationally do is position yourself to do as well, given any of the alternatives, as possible. And then which alternative happens is going to be what we would call luck. And so you'll do a little bit better or a little bit worse. Now, I don't think in general people's lives are made or ruined by luck. But I think, and if you're, a total loser in life and you're just blaming your bad luck, then I think that's on you. Likewise, if you're a real success who's really repeatedly achieving things, and somebody's saying it's only luck, I think that's wrong or innovation. But if you're somebody who inherited a lot of wealth, and a few decades later, you're not dramatic, you haven't built Amazon, and you haven't become a beggar. But there's a question as to whether you're 10 or 20% more or less rich than you would have been if you just invested in a mutual fund, right? There, I think there's a lot of play for luck, whether you're, how much percent richer or poorer than you are, and how much more or less famous than you are. Likewise, whether you win a certain election, that's very close. There's some skill involved and some luck involved, right? I mean, I think the last American election could have gone to either candidate. I think Clinton ran a particularly bad campaign in a lot of ways. But, a few different things that had happened differently, and she could have, or Trump could have won bigger. So it was just that close, right? And there are a lot of elections that are like that. And there are a lot of business things that are like that too, that are just close. And part of what being rational is going in is knowing that this is close. This is tight, and I have to be prepared for either outcome coming. And that's what that preparedness that you're talking about in saying luck is preparedness and so forth amounts to.
Thank you.
Stephen, do you have a question?
Nick must have a question.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
I really don't know. I didn't realize I was walking into
Last chance to ask a question, anybody?
So let me think.
All right, Eamon's gonna ask a question.
Oh crap.
And not about Trump, please, or
That's
the
a good
Kardashians.
Trump. Yeah, Kardashians.
So this one's going to be about Theresa May, or where are we getting that?
Yeah. So I'm interested in the problem of recognizing what you can and can't control in your own psychology. So I don't know, you already talked quite a lot about it and gave me quite a lot to think about, but for me that's kind of an extremely interesting part. So there's the aspect of, so Rand talks a lot about it in the The Art of Nonfiction, I think, and Art of Fiction, where she talks about. Well, it's also linked to the creativity bit in this essay, which is you have the power over rearranging things, but not creating things out of nowhere. And then the idea of, I think this is from Onkar Ghatel's talk, where he talks about you have reins over your mind. You don't, necessarily, you don't think of your mind as something where you can just sort of do anything you like. You sort of steer it in a way, I guess. And then the idea of you build up your character over a long period of time, which makes me think of like your character is like a big ship that is sailing somewhere, and you kind of, to change its direction, you have to change its destination, you have to like change the direction, but you have to like wait over a period of time to actually change those things.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. You turn the tiller, and it takes some time for the ship for the course to change after you've moved the tiller.
Yeah. And then it all connects with quite a lot of things. So there's another essay by Rand, which is What Can One Do, I think, where I don't remember some reader writes in saying, I'm frustrated with the state of the world, how can we change stuff? And she warns against thinking that you can just, change the world easily. Like everything, again, it comes back to things having an identity, things work in a certain way. You have to have the effect, you have to enact the cause. So you have to basically go out and discover the causes to change stuff. So, yeah, I don't know if we can talk about how to recognize those things that are within your power to change and focusing on those things. Because I think we spend a lot of time, not focusing on those things.
Well, that's a big topic.
Yeah.
Here are a few thoughts that are relevant to identifying something. You can't control other people and their minds, right? So you can't make other people think or not. You can't make other people know things that they don't know. All you can do is you can make them rational versus irrational. Those are choices that they're going to have to make. And even if they are being rational, you can't expect them to learn or realize their errors, if they're making errors, other than in the ways in which it's possible for people to learn and realize their errors, which is slowly and over time if they're big errors. Rarely does somebody have a moment and they see they were wrong about everything. And even if they do have a moment where they notice something that makes them question a whole lot of stuff they believed heretofore, it usually takes them a long time to process that and figure out where to go from there. So if you're trying to change the culture, you have to expect it to be slow. You have to expect individuals, to be made up of individuals changing their mind, and that to happen slowly. And you have to think about, well, how does it happen in the cases where it does happen? How has the culture changed in cases where the culture has really changed? Study some examples of that and see what you can learn about it, so how you can pick up on whether it's happening. And then think of cases where other people have changed their minds, or where you've changed your mind, and how that happened. Where you think it's a change for the good, also where it's a change for the bad. But we're focusing on trying to achieve good things. So where it's a change for the good, or where there's been a change for the bad that's been averted in yourself or in other people. And think about how that happened. What was the texture of it? What was the detail of it? What was the narrative like, in the concrete? And then what general lessons can you draw from that, using as orientation in trying to draw the general lessons? The fact that there are kind of basic choices people can make over how to use their minds. But then, even if you're using your mind as best as possible, it takes work and time to learn things. and to figure out where you've made mistakes and to figure out what's true. So in talking about dealing with other people and changing the culture, that's the kind of set of things I'd have in mind. And I would then think of big cultural value changes for the good and for the bad that have happened in your lifetime that you're able to observe. So whatever you think about it, the change in attitude towards homosexuality and particularly towards gay marriage in almost all of our lifetimes have been palpable. Maybe not so much the younger people, but even there. But certainly if you're in your 40s or over, you can remember on both sides of the pond the general attitude towards gays and gays being married changing a lot. And I think even if you're 25 or 30, you can remember this or easily recreate it by reading biographies or talking to people who are a bit older than you. Right? So how did that happen? Whether you think that change is for the good, as I do, or for the bad, or neutral, notice that that's a big shift. Likewise, interracial marriage, that's a big shift. Likewise, here's another shift I think that's positive, that's a little bit larger time scale than that, and that may be reversing direction now. But think of the shift towards a more free market attitude in the 70s and 80s in America and in the UK. So the Thatcher Revolution in the UK, but also, you know, there was a change that made that possible. She couldn't have gotten elected in 1960. So how did that happen? Think about, you know, what was going on that happened. And now what's happened in the other direction, that your candidates on both political sides are pretty unappealing these days. More unappealing, I think, on Labour, but still worse than, you know, Corbyn is not, you know, Blair, right? This is something's gone bad. And I think likewise in American politics, something has gone worse since the, you know, 80s. So those are changes for the good and the bad that we've seen in politics in our lifetimes or in our and our parents' lifetimes, depending on how old each of you is. Think about what that was like, what was happening, research it, learn a little about it. If you're interested in cultural change, if you're interested in individual change, think about times when you've learned and developed, and people who you've known have, and times when you've made mistakes for a period and gotten worse than the mistake and then maybe got out of it and got better. And think about what were you doing, how were you functioning, and where could you have been more sensitive to evidence than you weren't? And where were you being sensitive to evidence? There was something you needed to see that you hadn't seen. And then what was the thing and why did that have such a big impact on you? And can you show that kind of a thing to someone else? Maybe the particular thing you saw, the particular bit of evidence, won't make the same impact on that person as it did on you, a particular book or event you witnessed. But if you think about, like, why did that event really clear things up for me, or that formulation in that book? What was it about where I was at that made that the thing that helped me to see some new truth? And then if I understand both about myself and about the thing I noticed, what it was that made that a kind of sea change moment for me, how can I identify what will be the similar moments for someone else? And that's something you think a lot about as a teacher, if you're trying to help people learn and understand things. I think it's something you need to think about as a parent. I'm not a parent yet myself, but you know, I assume that it's something that goes on in parenting, and in psychotherapy, and in other fields where you're, you know, influencing other people's minds or trying to help them grow. So those are the I've given examples of the political and the interpersonal. And then the other one is within your own psychology. If you have a kind of problem that you're dealing with and you don't know what's in your control or not, struggling with an addiction or depression or something else, you can focus on some things that you can really tell are in your control in the moments when you are not in a, you know, dark mood or in a place where you're not sure how much you have control over. There are moments when you are more in control, hopefully. And in those moments, you can focus on what choices do you make? What choices can you make that are better or worse? And then you can think about, are there things I could do with those choices to make my situation better in the situations where I have fewer choices available to me? And then you can think about also what people are there who seem to have fought and done relatively well finding these problems. There are people who've gotten over depression or panic attacks or whatever. You could read about them and look into them and try to figure out what helped them. And I think what you'll find is there are drugs that help, and also there are techniques that leverage the choice you do have in the times when you're able to make them to help you do better in the periods where you have less choice. Things like making particular plans of action for what you'll do if you are overcome by suicidal thoughts or something. There are kind of plans you can put in place that you wouldn't be able to come up with when you're in the moment of suicidality. But if you come up with it before, you can think, no, this is what I should do when I feel that way. There's one of my friends, a psychologist, has told me a bit about some of these practices. So there's in psychology, in dealing with other people and in dealing with society, ways to look for, things to keep in mind when looking for what's in your control and what isn't, and what you can do to leverage your control.
Thanks.
All right, Dr. Salmieri, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, and hope to see you guys in the UK sometime.
Yeah.
Always great when I get to come up with
All right.